はじめまして皆さん、よろしくお願いします。Now, I've tried doing this a number of times, and this is probably the third time. Third time's the charm. So, it just so happens that I was ready to quit because the evidence that I was going with suggested the opposite of what I was trying to argue. But I thought, why not go back, take a step back and make a video about what I found instead of what I wanted to say. Now I want to talk about Sir Philip Sidney, noted Elizabethan courtier and poet. That makes him a late 16th century author, and in particular his famous sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go with Wikipedia because sources that I want to look at in detail are a little different, and Wikipedia will do for now. So Sir Philip Sidney, born 1554, was an English poet, courtier, scholar, and soldier who is remembered as one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan age. His works include Astrophel and Stella, which is what I want to talk about. Now, to jump to the subject of this video, what I wanted to talk about is the personal aspect of the poem sequence, the sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella. Now, when I was an undergrad, and I don't know if it's different where you're from, but when I was an undergrad, the single fact that was hammered into our heads, as it were, is that the Astrophel of Astrophel and Stella is Sir Philip Sidney himself, and the Stella, the woman he loves, was basically Penelope Devereux, who was married to Robert Rich. Just got that from Wikipedia, by the way. I mean, as a side note, I've managed to forget most of the things that I studied in undergrad, so I'm going to go back to a few basic details as I go through these videos, so I know practically as much as anyone else on the subject. So, to come back. Now the thing is that apparently this isn't necessarily the case, but it's not really something that was brought up in class. We were made to understand that Astrophel could easily be identified with Philip Sidney. Now, in the defense of my professors, it's not as though I was paying attention very much. So, I mean, the idea that there is a separation between the poetic persona and the poet himself was probably discussed. And but be that as it may, what struck me is something else. See, this little detail probably wasn't brought up in class, but there is this little bit of an age gap between Astrophel and Stella, assuming that they're based on real people. Now, as Wikipedia tells us, in 1572, at the age of 18, Sidney was elected to Parliament, and in the same year he traveled to France. Returning to England in 1575, Sidney met Penelope Devereux, who would later marry Robert Rich. Although much younger, she would inspire his famous sonnet sequence of the 1580s, Astrophel and Stella. How much younger? Wikipedia tells us that Penelope Rich, aka the Stella from the poems, was born in 1563. Omoshiroi. Now, I don't remember when exactly I found this out. It was probably after this was discussed in class, not very soon afterwards. So, it's always sort of stuck in my head. So, all these years afterwards, I wanted to start my time on YouTube by making a video about how Sidney was, dare I say, kind of sus. Now, what's interesting is that the cancel video that I was meaning to put out can't be made because, as it turns out, Astrophel, the speaker in the poems, is probably not necessarily the poet himself. Ergo, Stella, the star that Astrophel loves, is probably not Penelope Rich. Now, I managed to find a few papers, essays from back in the day, which actually argues that Sidney isn't literally Astrophel, which means that it's been known for a while, right? And true to form, I'm playing catch up about a century later. But be that as it may, I mean, it's fine, I guess. Let's start with what one Jack Stillinger said way back in October of 1960. Astrophel and Stella first appeared in 1591, printed from a circulating manuscript by Thomas Newman, who later in the same year printed a second version, altered in some 350 places, based on a manuscript apparently either supplied or approved by the Sidney family. It was given its final authorized form in the Arcadia volume of 1598. 5 basic facts about the sequence may be noted at the outset. 1. The date or dates of composition are not known. 2. The poems circulated in manuscript before they were published. Sidney refers to others' reception of them in sonnets 57, 74, and 84. 3. There is no apparent significance in the fact that sonnet 37, stanzas 18 to 25 of the 8th song, stanzas 5 to 7 of the 10th song, and all of the 11th song were printed for the first time in 1598. The idea that these passages were withheld from earlier publication because they revealed too much is not tenable. 4. The order of the sonnets is identical, except for the reversal of sonnets 55 and 56 in the unauthorized version printed from a circulating manuscript, in the version supervised by Sidney's sister, and in the 2 intervening editions, is forever fixed. Now, in the same paper, Stillinger writes, Orthodox critical opinion holds that Astrophel and Stella autobiographically describe Sidney's love for Penelope Rich. To what extent this opinion is justified by acceptable evidence is a specific biographical problem that I shall investigate, evaluating in turn external biographical evidence, then evidence contained in sonnets, and finally evidence and testimony of Sidney's and Penelope's contemporaries. Now, based on a letter from 1576, it's not unlikely, Stillinger tells us, that Sidney may have been in discussions, let's say, to marry Penelope Devereux, which might be a little bit sus, I guess, but as Stillinger goes on to tell us, the evidence in the poems isn't really all that strong. Sonnets 37 and 24 neither mention Stella nor have any express connection with other sonnets or with whatever narrative can be found in the sequence. That the nymph of sonnet 37 is Stella may be argued on the grounds that a poem celebrating a woman rich in all beauties would be inappropriate to the sequence if that woman were not Stella, but the identification cannot be proved on such grounds. Although sonnet 35 does mention Stella in the crucial passage, fame doth even grow rich, naming my Stella's name. To find here an indirect reference to Penelope depends first, as I said earlier, upon the knowledge that she is Stella. Basically, there's just this little bit of evidence in the poems to suggest that there's this pun on the word rich, which suggests Lord Rich, who married Penelope. But then again, that it's very flimsy, and it just might involve people reading too much into it. Now, again, in the notes to his translation of Orlando Furioso, Sir John Harrington wrote, Sir Philip Sidney often comforted himself in his sonnets of Stella, though despairing to attain his desire. After quoting this passage, Hudson remarks, Harrington was an epigrammatist and knew how to introduce a pun subtly. Who can doubt that in this passage, which comes to a climax in the word rich, he is apprising the informed world that he is in on the secret. But a manuscript has since been discovered in Arundel Castle containing in Harrington's handwriting the section heading Sonnets of Sir Philip Sidney to the Lady Rich, followed by the first sonnet of Astrophel and Stella. Since the manuscript is undated, Harrington could have written the heading and copied the sonnet, apparently intended to transcribe others. The only contemporary evidence denying the identification of Penelope with Stella consists of 2 poems by Spencer and Lodowick Brisket in the group of Astrophel Elegies, published with Spencer's Calling Clouds Come Home Again. Now, as Stillinger says, but even if we have established at least a partial identification, the initial question is still far from answered, whether Astrophel and Stella autobiographically describe Sidney's love for her. Now, the biggest argument against identifying Astrophel with Sidney is basically that it was a genre of poetry where people used to write in a certain way, and doesn't mean that it was historically accurate or based on real people. Stillinger says, 1. Lyric poetry is not necessarily autobiographical. 2. As a Renaissance courtier, Sidney would have been expected to write poetry whether or not he was in love. 3. An Elizabethan poet who chose a sonnet for his form would naturally have written about love, and if he were a good poet, his passion might sound sincere. 4. Sidney, as he himself says many times, regarded poetry as an art, not as an expression of reality. And 5. The variety of metrical forms in Astrophel and Stella suggests that Sidney may have been motivated primarily by artistic impulse. And of course, there's a lot more evidence against identifying Sidney with Astrophel. Walter G. Friedrich, for instance, way back in 1936, went through a great deal of evidence to tell us that Sidney was considering marriage to someone else at the time, and that all of those little hints in all of his written work that suggest that he was in love with Penelope Devereux don't actually mean anything. He probably felt nothing for Devereux. And any suggestions of marriage were broken off quite early. So there's nothing in the Arcadia, for instance, to suggest that he was thinking of Penelope Devereux. Ergo, he probably didn't mean her when he described his Stella. But I might add that there's Friedrich's take on Sonnet 24, which has a little pun with rich, which might not be a pun at all, where Friedrich says, the obvious meaning of the sonnet is that plenty makes men poor even in love. Only by accepting the conventional stories of Sidney's love for Penelope and of Lord Rich's abuse of his wife can we see in the sonnet praise for Penelope and scorn for her husband. And we have nothing to indicate that the public in 1591 knew that story. In Sonnet 35, there's again that suggestion of a pun, but if it was meant as a pun, it was not nearly so obvious to the Elizabethan reader as one might think. The context clearly shows that the word meaning is not used in the modern sense, but in the sense of declaring, setting forth. I mean, this might seem like a cop-out at this point, but really I could go on. So I think we've managed to conclude that Philip Sidney was probably not very sus. He was an overall nice guy who gave water to a dying soldier. Is it kind of sus that he was at least in talks to marry Penelope Devereux? It's not like it was up to him, right? And maybe it would be material for a different video altogether if I went into discussing sexual mores in the Elizabethan age and the kind of that separation between the licit and the illicit. I do recall reading a little something in a book of sonnets once, so maybe I should go and read that up. Anyway, I'll try to put this all together into a meaningful video. In conclusion, we've managed to conclude that Philip Sidney probably wasn't chasing a 12-year-old. So I guess I won't be canceling him today. Thank you for watching.
さようなら。私に高すぎます。自分の価値知っているでしょ。契約通り時間が終わります。これは締め切りで君の解放